Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Strange Playground. Apologies if I was sounding a little distracted and a little stuffed up in the last episode. I was not feeling very well at all. In fact, I was exhausted, not only from an infection of some sort, a cold, but also just from general work and whatnot. All better now, most certainly. And there's something that's come up again, and it's one of these things that comes up periodically if you operate in horror circles. It's one of those perennial subjects that just it keeps turning around. I imagine because it's one of those topics for which there is no clean or clear answer. It's actually one of those subjects that relates to a much wider discussion, and it revolves around H.P. Lovecraft, as it often does. Now, Lovecraft is a massively contentious figure in and of himself, massively contentious for a number of reasons. He's contentious because of his work which some regard as the very apex of cosmological metaphysical horror, some of which regard as risible and absurd and ridiculous, because of the nature of his writing. I mean, the nature of the style of his prose, which it can be taken as absolutely risible, as overblown, as ridiculously overwrought, as aspiring to a degree of horror that is absurd, it's actually ineffable in language, and therefore just comes off as absurd. And all of those are true to a degree, but also not. It's a rather complicated and contradictory matter. And he's also contentious as a human being. He's contentious as a human being because of his perspectives and his positions. And as anyone who knows anything about Lovecraft will tell you, if you've read his letters and his essays and whatnot, the man was monstrously conservative. He was terrified of pretty much everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. He was perpetually afraid, perpetually terrified. He seemed to operate in a condition of total anxiety. He was terrified of other human beings. He was terrified of society. He was terrified of this perceived erosion and decay of society from what he considered to be some sort of idealized state. He was very conservative in that regard, and is often the case with conservative perspectives. The condition that he idealized in his own mind never existed. It was a total fantasy, but he did have this fantasy in his head of a sort of Elysian past, and it was very much bizarrely, even though he was an American-born writer, it was related very much to a perception of a kind of Victorian England. It was very, very strange, very bizarre indeed. And as a result of that, was also very, very much racist, very much misogynist, very much homophobic, and anti-Semitic. That's very, very clear from his essays and also from his fiction as well. And those are matters that warrant discussion. That is undoubtedly the case. There was an essay released recently from, I can't quite remember where it's from, but it's from a prominent website or publication regarding horror, which talked about a need to move on from Lovecraft, that there is a necessity within the genre to move on not only from the man but from his ideas, from his imagery, and to a degree I can certainly see that. It's a kind of yes and no answer. It's not actually that clear cut. Yes, in the sense that in terms of the fiction there is so much that is derivative of Lovecraft. There is so much that's a derivative of Lovecraft and that simply attempts to emulate him in the same way that in fantasy so much attempts to emulate Tolkien. Certainly in the 1980s and early 1990s, there was just this flood of pseudo-Tolkien. And it's all pretty bad. It's all pretty bad. The same is true of Lovecraft. There is lots of pseudo-Lovecraft. There are lots of Lovecraft's imagery and ideas and mythos has actually spawned lots of subgenres of horror that are actually very prominent. There are lots of people who write within his mythos, for better or worse. You know, there are Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft stories out there, an entire series of books and novellas and short stories. There's Lovecraft erotica, which is really strange, and there are people like, say, Ramsey Campbell, who have expanded upon Lovecraft's mythology and made it their own. There are people like Rich Hawkins, who I know, who doesn't necessarily write within Lovecraft's mythology, but sort of he derives imagery and almost like a tonal quality from it to create his own work, to create his own thing. And I can certainly see how that can be a negative thing. It can be negative in the sense that it trammels us, in the sense that it can be difficult to move on or to find material that is not obsessed with the same stuff. However, I would argue that the reason that the influence of Lovecraft is so pervasive in terms of the fiction that exists out there is simply because the ideas and the images that he came up with have never been resolved and probably never will be, and also never equaled. There's something about certainly the ideas of Lovecraft, like the metaphysical nihilism, the cosmological nihilism of Lovecraft, that is very difficult to resolve in mythological terms, and has never been and never will be. It's very, very grim. It's very complex and ambiguous, and bizarrely secular, despite the fact that there are gods and there are demons and metaphysical entities. It is also bizarrely secular, in the sense that all of these phenomena are actually natural phenomena. They just happen to derive from dimensions and realities and states of being that we can't perceive or operate on. And in that regard, the reason that we can't move past Lovecraft, certainly in fictional terms, is because there is an ultimate quality to what he wrote about. There are fundamentally human concerns here, in that he deals with factors of reality that we cannot perceive and therefore cannot resolve to ourselves. It's actually impossible. Even if we moved on from, say, the specifically Lovecraftian, from the images and the concepts and the terms that he's become synonymous with, then those preoccupations would just crop up again. They just crop up again because they are universally human. The only way to transcend those notions is to stop being human. The only way that would ever happen, I would vouchsafe, I would theorize, is if we somehow found a way to transcend our humanity. So, for example, if there was some sort of transhumanist situation, so if there was some sort of genetic manipulation, some sort of technological discovery that allowed us to move on from being human. That's how you move on from Lovecraft. You move on from actually being human. The notion that, for example, they're not exclusively, but iconically Lovecraftian notion that we are adrift in a meaningless universe that has no regard for us. We are basically bits of grit in the eye of an uncaring entity, a god that perhaps doesn't even perceive we're there, apart from as an irritant or as something to be expunged. That's something that's very difficult to resolve, and it's why writers, certainly of horror, keep going back to it. We can't not go back to it. It's impossible. That preoccupation is so huge, it's so mythologically resonant, and it's so nihilistic and so suited to horror that we can't get past it. It's very difficult to move on from it. By the same token, I can certainly understand why we need to perhaps stop emulating Lovecraft. I can certainly understand why perhaps we need to exercise our imaginations more and try to come up with our own entities, our own creatures, our own notions, our own metaphysics and mythologies. Absolutely, I totally get that. That said, once again, the corollary to that is that Lovecraft's mythology is so vast and so open-ended and so expansive that the potential of it is infinite. As writers like Rich Hawkins and Ramsey Campbell have demonstrated, it's actually infinite. You can explore so many different things through it. You can add to it exponentially, that there are no real parameters there. It doesn't necessarily require getting over. You also have the other side of this coin, which is in terms of the man himself, and his perspectives and whatnot, which are undoubtedly present in his fiction. They are undoubtedly present. There is a very strong anti-Semitism, for example, in Lovecraft's fiction, very strong anti-Semitism, whereby you can guarantee if there is a Jewish character, they are going to start sprouting tentacles and be revealed to be like the spawn of some elder thing. That's definitely the case. There are phenomenally racist black characters and Arabic characters. There are no gay characters, interestingly, which you may regard as homophobic or as not, depending on your perspective. So the man himself was definitely homophobic. However, what I would say is that these are issues to take in to be tackled and discussed in and of themselves. They do not necessarily have significant influence upon the significance of his metaphysics or of the other ideas that he came up with, which are still prominent and relevant. It's a bizarre one. One can simultaneously analyze and condemn wholeheartedly the racism, the anti-Semitism, the homophobia, whilst at the same time appreciating the elements that still have potential, that still expand the realms of discussion, which still inspire. That is definitely the case. I mean, if we were to, say, throw aside all of the fiction, all of the poetry, all of the art that was ever produced by people that we disagree with on an ideological level, or that were bigoted assholes, for example, then we probably wouldn't read anything ever again. We would lose an entire traditions of art and of poetry and of fiction. That is not to say that these issues do not warrant discussion. They absolutely do, and we have to discuss them. But I would say that to wholeheartedly throw out Lovecraft's entire mythos and entire body of work on the basis that he was indeed a racist and an anti-Semite and a bigot is not a positive outcome. It is not a germane result. It doesn't provide any solution to anything, and in fact may cause some very serious harm. It may in fact cause some very serious harm to both the genre and literature as a whole. What we can do as intelligent and critical entities is go to Lovecraft's fiction. We can read it, we can appreciate the elements that we appreciate, and condemn the elements that are worthy of condemnation, without the two interpolluting one another, without sort of throwing baby out with the bathwater. And that is true of lots of writers. I mean, I love Philip K. Dick. Absolutely love Philip K. Dick, but the man was an asshole. The man was a paranoid, drug-addicted lunatic who was terrible to his family and to his friends and had some real issues, you know? I love the work of Mervyn Peake, who wrote Gormenghast. Now, Peake wasn't an unpleasant man by all accounts, but he was insane. He had some real psychological issues and was something of a terror to his family by the end of his life. I love the work of Stephen King. Stephen King, when he was a younger man, and he's quite happy to talk about this in interviews, he was an alcoholic and a drug addict and was quite terrible to people. That is just the way it is. Writers and artists are human beings as well, and as such are as contradictory and as ambiguous and unpleasant as anyone else can be. We all are. Everyone is. And it's a very tricky thing. I mean, a more relevant, a more recent example would be Orson Scott Card, who wrote Ender's Game. Now, Orson Scott Card is alive and is an awful man. I mean, he's a total bigot. He's a complete homophobic cunt. He's awful. Also very stupid. On that level, he's not very considered. He is a frothing demagogue who hates gay people, who has written long screeds about how LGBTQ people should be exterminated, basically. Now, for my part, I don't really like Ender's Game at all. I don't like his wider writing. I find it to be absolutely terrible. But I find it terrible on its own basis, not because the man himself is a bigoted twat, but I find it terrible on its own basis. I find its writing to be atrocious. I find the way it tries to justify drafting children into war absolutely appalling, and I just find it badly written. That said, I'm not calling for its censorship or for its abandonment. If people find something positive and inspiring out of it, then great. Especially if they take a positive message away from it, something that's humane, and that is empathetic, that is positive. Because in that regard, you've got something positive coming from something that's entirely negative. It's an example of maybe the work being wiser than the man, which is very often the case. I mean, another very good example is C.S. Lewis. Like many people, I grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia. And I found Lewis to be a very interesting case because he's very like Lovecraft to me. It's very easy to condemn Lewis as being an awful man, and in many respects he was, and in many respects that awfulness is very much in his writing. I mean, the last book in the Chronicles of Narnia celebrates the death of children. It regards it as a wonderful thing because they get to keep some idiot Victorian notion of innocence, which is a total misconception anyway. But that's kind of a digression. It's a discussion to have in and of itself. The more I read about C.S. Lewis, in the same way the more I read about H.P. Lovecraft, the more sympathy I have for them as human beings. They were both very broken. Both of them were very broken. Lovecraft was broken from the very beginning. Both of his parents committed suicide. They both died in insane asylums. He had a powerfully, if not abusive, then very strange relationship with his mother, very non-standard. And then with the aunties who adopted him, very strange relationship. He didn't really have much of a chance. And the more I read about him, the more it's very clear to me that Lovecraft had some condition, that he had quite a few conditions probably, quite likely some form of depression, whether it was clinical, whether it was bipolar, whatever. He certainly had some kind of depressive condition, probably on the spectrum, most likely on the autistic spectrum, given his habits, given the accounts of people who used to interact with him. He demonstrates a lot of behaviours that are very, 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 very redolent of autism. He seems to be a man who is afraid, who is broken and who is afraid, and who has sort of turned that into an ideology. Okay, it's not a very positive ideology, it's a powerfully negative one, actually, but he was also not terribly active with it. He was actually resigned. When you read his letters and whatnot, he was actually resigned to what he considered to be the collapse of culture and society as a result of things like immigration and whatnot. He wasn't an active participant in resisting it. He never actually did anything. He wasn't part of any particular political party. He didn't go, bloody hell, he certainly didn't go to any kind of rally or anything like that. He would have killed himself. He would have had a heart attack if he went to anything like that. He would have been terrified. The same is true of Lewis. Lewis, on one hand, can be regarded as a corrupter of childhood, as an abuser of childhood imagination to try and condition children with his very particular form of Christianity. On the other hand, when you look at his past and when you realise that he lost everyone who he adored, his wife, his child, and he loved that. He really did worship the ground they walked on. They were his entire reason for being. That seems to have been the thing that did for C.S. Lewis. After that, that is when he starts not making a great deal of sense. And I can well understand why he turned to an ideology which, however unlikely, promised the possibility of seeing them again, which was a very particular form of Christianity. I can understand them as human beings, and that develops a degree of sympathy, not for the ideas, but for the people, for the men. Like Lovecraft in particular would have hated me. He would have absolutely loathed me because I'm gay and also rather bohemian, and he would have hated my work as well because my work is very anti-Lovecraft. Although it derives certain images from it, it's very anti-Lovecraft in that the metaphysics I provide, the horror I create, is often it's bound up with this strange utopianism, which I never realized until it was pointed out to me. But there is this hopefulness even in the worst of my mythologies, I suppose, in the darkest, in the most nihilistic. There is a kind of hopefulness in them, which is very anti-Lovecraft. It's very anti-Lovecraft. It's kind of it's gone through Lovecraft and come out the other side, as it were, which is interesting to me. That is interesting to me because it seems to me that for all the fact that Lovecraft presented his own mythology as the ultimate negativity, as the ultimate reason for nihilism and misanthropy, I find that there to be a hopefulness inherent in it. There is potential in this mythology for human beings to become something other, to transcend themselves, to perceive beyond themselves, for their perspectives to be fundamentally altered by something external. I find that very inspiring. I find that very hopeful indeed. It's it's an odd thing. It's a very, very odd thing indeed. It depends upon, I suppose it depends upon where you're coming at the fiction from, and whether you are willing to allow the writer to impose upon you their own interpretations of it or not, or their own agendas in writing it. And despite the fact that he would have hated me, I would have loved to have spoken to the man. I would have loved to have sat down and spoken to the man, because I think he would have been fascinating. I think he would have been absolutely fascinating. This nervous, twitchy, quiet, reserved jumble of neuroses and of ideas and of ambitions and agendas and despairs. I find that fascinating. The same is true of Lewis. Lewis, I think I could have had a really, really interesting debate with, because, again, I sort of operate in defiance of everything that he wanted to prescribe for humanity, by the very nature of my being. I mean, he would have been appalled by my homosexuality. He would have been absolutely appalled by it, and by what I write. He would have been absolutely appalled at the metaphysics that I create, because, again, my metaphysics in my fiction is not just antithetical to Christianity, it's totally apart from it. It disregards Christianity almost totally, and creates something alternative, something other, that is often not prescribed by a god or by a divinity or by prophecy or anything like that. It's more personal, it's more acute and jagged and fractured than that, and far less certain. Far less certain. But yes, this argument that we need to move on from Lovecraft it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one because I do understand the principle behind it, however ill-stated it might be, but I also powerfully disagree with certain elements of it, certainly as an absolute statement or in its totality. What I find is that it provides sort of fruitful ground for discussion. It's very difficult in the current climate. It's very difficult in the current climate because Lovecraft is one of those people who, if he were alive now, would probably be an appalling human being. Probably he would, but we know what kind of political persuasions he would certainly have, let's put it that way. He would be an appalling human being, and that would make it very difficult. But he isn't. He isn't alive now. And in and of himself can do no harm. He can do no harm. And what I find, certainly, from the people who seem to enjoy Lovecraft, ironically, it's the people that he would have hated, like me. It's the people who are actually very, very, very liberal socially, and very, very much not racist. They can look at that element of Lovecraft's fiction and say, yeah, that's pretty appalling, but we can disregard that. We can discuss that somewhere else. It's a separate discussion from, say, the cosmology, the metaphysics, the monsters, the imagery. I mean, again, the reason that the imagery from Lovecraft, the monsters and the situations and the imagery comes up again and again and again is because it's so good. It's because it's so difficult to get past. It's so difficult to transcend. Because it's so bizarre that it's rarely, if ever, been bettered. It's rarely, if ever, been bettered. And that makes it kind of ubiquitous. Yes, I mean, I would certainly agree that there's a lot of crap. There's a lot of very bad writing that utilizes Lovecraft stuff, no doubt. And which, those who just want to be the next Lovecraft need to get over that, really, because we have moved on. I mean, we moved on 20-odd years ago. If you look at Clive Barker's material, for example. Now, I would argue that Clive Barker's material is what ultimately transcends Lovecraft in terms of both his imagery and his preoccupations, because Barker has a very similar elaboration in terms of his metaphysics and his transgressive imagery, but it's from a very different perspective and in a very different emphasis. Barker's metaphysics and imagery is often very erotic. It has a frisson, it's energizing rather than enervating, and it's about the potential of discovery and rapture and revelation, rather than this the nihilism of Lovecraft. And of course, I mean, Barker is one of those people. It's one of the areas where I disagree with him, actually, but Barker is one of those people who hates Lovecraft. Absolutely just hates the man, hates his work, and totally disregards it. Really, really despises H.P. Lovecraft. Really interesting, that. Very, very interesting indeed. Again, I would love to sit down and have a discussion with him about it. I really, really would. When I could get over fawning terribly over the work of his that I can't get over, stuff like Weave World and whatnot. But yeah, it's a discussion that's particularly difficult to have in the current political climate, where there's so much shrillness and shouting from all perspectives and sides. I mean, which I understand to a certain degree. I mean, it's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion or even a halfway reasoned discussion with people who want you exterminated. And let's not beat about the bush. There are lots of people and movements in operation right now, in not just in niche circles, but in very much mainstream political and cultural circles, who do want us exterminated. They try to hide it behind euphemistic language, They try to pretend to be reasonable, but they're not. When you boil it down, what they're arguing for is a kind of genocide. They would rather a world where certain demographics of people don't exist, because their existence complicates the world in ways they don't like, and that's ultimately it. It's a genocidal argument. In that circumstance, it's very difficult to have a reasonable discussion. It's very about someone like Lovecraft. It's very difficult indeed. But I would argue that the exercise is worthwhile, if nothing else. It allows us to temper ourselves. It allows us to consider how, for one thing, how people can come to these perspectives, like Lovecraft himself, who is, when you look into it, was so terribly damaged, and that seems to be what he's expressing through his racism and his anti-Semitism, this fear of the other. It's this fear of everything, of the other, of other human beings, and it becomes ironic in Lovecraft's case, because he married a Jewish woman. It's just so bizarre, so very bizarre. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fertile ground for discussion, I find. So, yeah, we need to get past Lovecraft? Yeah, but not entirely. Yes and no. It's a tricky one. I would love to know what you think. If there are, if anyone would like to chime in, please do so. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what your particular perspectives on this are. Until next time, ladies and gents, until next time, bye-bye!